Hello, this is Mrs. Brantner, Superintendent of Schools of the Marcellus School District, coming to you from my office. We actually had a board meeting last evening. I'm not sure if it'll be last evening when you see this video, but probably pretty close. And did our first budget presentation, giving some sort of background information and context for the budget as we put it together over the next couple of months. So I wanted to share that information with those of you that aren't able to make those meetings so that you can have the same information going forward. So I'm using the exact same presentation we actually shared last evening and just walking you through it. So let's get started. So the first slide that you'll see actually details our enrollment back to 2010-2011 school year. You may or may not be aware, but school districts typically use some sort of a company or service to create a projection for them so that they can use that information to help them with planning going forward. While projections obviously are better than having nothing, they sometimes are pretty accurate, and I've also seen occasions where they're not as accurate. Admittedly, I think the projections that we've seen done here in Marcellus have been overall pretty accurate, but there are some portions of it that we've learned are not exactly on par. So you can see in this particular chart, there are boxes where there are two numbers separated by a slash. The first number is actual enrollment, the slash, and then the number after it was the projection. So you can see cases where the projection followed actual. You can see cases where there is a disparity between the two. I would say the biggest disparity comparing projected and actual is happening at kindergarten. And the dilemma that we're facing as a result is that it's really difficult for us to figure out, based on the projection, how many sections we need. So over the past 3 years since I've been here, we've actually had 6 sections at kindergarten. And I'm anticipating that we're going to plan to do the same for the coming year, simply because even though the projection says 74, you can see that last year's projection was 78 and we ended up with 95 students walking in. 3 years ago, the board and I had a discussion, and you'll see the results of that discussion on this slide, where we talked about, hey, if we can hit certain targets for class sizes at the K-6 level, what would you be looking for? And obviously this is much easier to talk about than class sizes 7 through 12, simply because at the K-6 level, literally you have 100 kids, you divide it by the number of students you want to see in a class, and that results in your number of sections. So if I have 100 kids, 5 sections, 20 kids in a section, I know very specifically what I have, and I can actually create pretty even sections, where at the 7-12 level, scheduling is not that simple and unfortunately leads to a lot of interesting dynamics and anomalies. So you can see that the discussion with the board 3 years ago netted a result of hoping to keep kindergarten right around 18 or less if possible, and then grades 3 through 6, 23 or less if possible. We've been pretty good at hitting those targets. Sometimes when it's close, we might exceed a little bit, especially if we feel like that particular group of students can handle. There are times when we have some students that just need additional support, and it makes it more difficult to have larger class sizes. So we try to keep that in mind as well. So the next 2 slides that you'll see actually just show the current school year enrollment K-6 by grade level with the number of sections that we have and the resulting class size. So you can see in all cases, K through 3, we're nicely hitting or staying within our targets, and grades 4, 5, and 6 the same. Obviously, if we were to cut sections at any of these grade levels, we would end up exceeding those targets by a significant amount. So we actually are, in a good position right now in terms of class sizes at our K-6 level. So taking a look at the 1920 school year with a smaller kindergarten class last year, and the anticipation of potentially having, we usually have a few students that are retained for a variety of reasons. We believe that the number will be even smaller moving forward to first grade, and we feel that we can easily cut a section, still stay right about at our target. And as you'll see as time goes on in this presentation, we are facing budget challenges. The budget challenges over the past few years have actually not been as great as we're now seeing, and some of that is a result of some aid that was restored to us back in the 16-17 school year really helped us get to a good place over the last few years. But now, as costs continue to go up and revenue doesn't match pace with that, we're going to be looking for places to make reductions. And, based on overall enrollment decline, this is a reduction that we can make and potentially sustain. So taking a look then at the 1920 projected not only staffing levels, but also what the section numbers and enrollment in those sections would look like, you can see that, again, we can pretty much hit our targets. Kindergarten, I have a question mark for number of students. You can imagine why. While we do have some enrollments already on the books, typically we don't have a great sense of who's walking in the door until June and sometimes, honestly, August. So we, as I said earlier, anticipate going with 6 sections, and we anticipate that we will probably be under our expected enrollment in each class of 18, which is sort of, we hope, our upper limit for our kindergarten students. And then moving forward to grades 4, 5, and 6, the other piece that you'll see is that we are contemplating whether or not another section needs to be reduced at 4, 5, and 6. That would potentially come in the 6th grade. One of the things that some of you may realize is that we've done a pretty significant programmatic change in 6th grade, and we're sort of just in the beginning stages, the first year of doing that. And the design that we have set up sort of necessitates an even number of sections in order to do the teaming that we have actually been doing. So if possible, we would like to retain 6 sections for another year at 6th grade and just get our feet under us. But again, as we continue to refine the budget, this is an area that potentially we could make a reduction and still be meeting our class size targets that we would like to hit. Talking about revenue and school aid, it's important to have a sense of some of our numbers, some of the calculations that the state uses to look at these things, and also how things are trending here in the district. So this particular slide is a calculation of our free and reduced lunch eligibility. This gives us a really good window in terms of how our income wealth in the community might be trending. Obviously, if we have an increase of free and reduced lunch eligibility, potentially our income wealth is declining. And so you can see that since the 2012-2013 school year, when we were at 15.1% free and reduced lunch, that we are going in a direction of having more kids needing that support to the tune of over 7% in change, which is a significant percentage amount. As we discussed last night in our board meeting, there's a variety of factors. I mean, as you watch enrollment decline from 2012 to 2019, you're actually starting with a base that is smaller, a smaller number of students with which to do the math problem. So another way to look at this that would be helpful would be to look at numbers of students to really figure out, is the trend going in as drastic a direction as this particular percentage shows. But this is what I offer you for today without getting into the numbers year by year, which would take quite a bit of time to pull together. This next slide actually shows this year's free and reduced price lunch calculation, which you saw on the previous slide, but this breaks this year's number down into percent by grade level. And you can see there's some fairly decent differences from grade level to grade level. One of the things that I noted last evening in our board meeting discussion was simply that often you see a greater disparity between the elementary figure and the junior senior high figure, sometimes due to the fact that older students don't always want to take advantage of free and reduced lunch. Some of them are working and just would prefer not to do that. But actually we're seeing those numbers pretty close together, which is a good sign that kids that are really needing that support are getting the support. So this next slide really gets into some of the nitty-gritty. One of the things that Governor Cuomo started, several years ago is capping the property tax levy increase at what he called 2%. And I think for most of our voting public, that 2% number is what sticks with them, when in all actuality, this property tax levy cap calculation is a multi-step formula, as you can see from this slide. And one of the calculations within the formula actually uses 2%. But because there are different exclusions that are either added in and sometimes taken out, there is some skew to that number. In fact, that 2% cap can actually be quite a bit higher than 2%. And depending on what's going on with your exclusions, it can also be much lower than 2%. So we find ourselves this year exceeding that 2% cap, or I guess I should say our number is above 2%, but that is our 2% cap. The reason for that is that we have a building project, the one that's happening now at the high school, that the public voted on, I think 5 or 6 years ago, predated my time here in the district. But I am certain that when that building project was discussed, especially with the magnitude and the price tag that comes with it, that there was a discussion of an impact on the tax levy. That's generally something that is done, and usually they equate it to, hey, if you have a $100,000 house, the increase would be about, $30 or $45. I made a commitment last night to dig those materials out so that I could make sure that I'm providing you exactly what was said, seeing that I wasn't working here then to know, but I can imagine. Just so you have that as a point of reference, because this year our property tax levy cap calculation is showing that tax impact. So I think the challenging part for a school district is that a community votes on a project, they approve it, and what they're actually approving is our ability to levy a tax to pay for the local share. The difficult part comes in when you actually have to start paying for it. It's part of your school district budget, and in essence, you have to approve it again. So you agreed, this community agreed, back 5 or 6 years ago when that vote was taken, that you would approve the levying of a tax, and you're going to be in a position to have to double approve that, or at least to consider double approving it when you vote on the budget in May. So what's happening is that we have an increase in our debt service payment. Remember, debt service, I've talked to you about before, is basically a fancy term for the mortgages that we pay on our buildings. And we have a larger mortgage payment coming on because the project is nearing completion, and now we have to start paying for it. We're bonding money to pay the bills associated with that project. So you're going to see in this calculation, when you look at the bottom line, the maximum percent increase of our tax levy for next year with a simple majority is actually 4.71%. That's giving us the additional tax revenue to pay that mortgage. Now, we are in the very early stages of the budget. I'm not sure at this point what Tony Sinaccio, the business official, and I will recommend, or what the board will accept in terms of moving forward and putting something out to the voters. So more to come. Just want you to be aware of what that number is and why the number is higher than 2%. So in January, the governor always puts out an initial aid run, and then of course the Assembly and the Senate start negotiating back and forth to figure out what the actual numbers will be. And so we always take a look at what that initial run is now, and wanted to give you a context for some of the numbers. So looking at a couple of what's called our expense-driven aids, BOCES and transportation aids, starting with BOCES, the term expense-driven aids means if you don't spend money in that category, you do not receive aid. The aid that you receive is based on the fact that you expended. So obviously BOCES exists so that school districts can purchase services for them and for our use, and in doing so, we're actually finding a more cost-effective way to achieve said service, either because we don't have the critical mass to provide the service ourselves and to do it in a cost-effective way, we choose to go through BOCES. So probably some of the most known ways that we use BOCES would be our career and tech students going over, but there are a myriad of other things that we use BOCES for. So this particular chart shows you the trending of our reimbursement rate. When we spend money at BOCES, we get a portion of that reimbursed and as part of our state aid. And you can see that the percentage of reimbursement has been following a pretty similar pattern for the last 3 or 4 years. So when you take a look at the aid run in a couple of slides from now, if you see an increase year over year in BOCES aid, that can be attributed at this point to the fact that we're spending more money in that category. We need a service, we feel like we can get it the cheapest through BOCES, and so we purchase it. And then of course, because our expense went up, our aid goes up. What you want to watch for is a fluctuation in the percent reimbursement. If our percent reimbursement increases, we would actually realize a slight increase in aid. We would actually be reimbursed at a higher rate than we have previously. So that would be a great scenario. The negative scenario happens when our reimbursement rate drops and we're then getting less money per dollar expended at BOCES. So that would be an additional cut to our aid. Even if the aid line showed an increase, it would actually be a reduction. It's just because we bought more services there. Transportation aid works exactly the same way, and you can see that since 15-16, our reimbursement rate has been pretty consistent. So getting into our state aid history, lots of numbers on this particular page, but we gave you the history back to 2012, 2013 to the present day. Starting with the top line, foundation aid is a non-categorical aid. It is basically a sum of money that school districts are provided from the state of New York to give them basically a base revenue source to support whatever needs to be supported financially in the operations of a school district. So I don't have to expend it in a particular category. It's just aid I can use for any purpose. You can see that basically starting in 16-17 moving forward, our aid amount has been pretty consistent, no huge jumps. But prior to that, there was a pretty big jump between 15-16 and 16-17. I don't know if those of you that love school finance and have been following it for many years might remember that when Cuomo, actually right before Cuomo came into office, but I think Cuomo made it a little bit more popular and was a little bit more forthright about explaining. He arrived on the scene in New York State when there was a pretty significant budget deficit in the state, and he felt he needed to take drastic measures to close that budget gap. And one of the ways that he did that was taking large chunks of aid from school districts, called it the gap elimination adjustment. The New York State budget had a gap. He needed to eliminate the gap, so he adjusted our aid, not in a direction that we were happy with. So over a period of years, he was able to eliminate the state's budget gap, leading up to a restoration of the amount that he did take away in 16-17. So since then, we haven't seen real dramatic changes in foundation aid. And as you can imagine, other than tax revenue, this is about the only other revenue source we count on. So not getting additional monies in this area has definitely a negative impact on what we're able to do here, supported by our budget. Most of the other aids you see are either expense-driven aids, so you can see BOCES and transportation that we just talked about. High excess cost aid and private excess cost aid are also expense-driven aids in the special education category. And then building aid is another expense-driven aid. This is where you're seeing we are having an increase in aid because we have that new mortgage payment, that new debt service payment coming online. So while the payment is greater, the aid reimbursement is greater, but we do still have a net local share that we have to pay for, which is where the whole property tax levy cap increase comes in. So in terms of the rest of the aids, textbook, computer, library, those aids are all largely based on enrollment, and there's a rate applied per pupil. If you see fluctuations in the negative there, it largely has to do with enrollment decline. If you see an uptick, it may be that they've changed the multiplier slightly. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a picture of at least our initial aid situation based on the governor's January runs. So we finally got to a point last evening where we talked about our initial 19-20 budget. Generally, we do a sort of a rollover, taking programs that we wish to continue, rolling everything forward, rolling staff forward, and so on and so forth, to give us a picture. With some adjustments made at this point, we ended up with a gap of just over $640,000. This is a bit more dramatic of a gap than we've had over the last few years since the elimination of gap elimination adjustment. But we're already at work trying to figure out some cuts that can be made to reduce that gap and get us to be even on the budget revenue and expenditure picture. So the next page shows you the two reductions we are proposing initially as we start going to work at tackling this deficit. The first is something that I've talked about at least quite a bit at the board table and internally here in the school, that we are going to be having a reduction of one person in the administrative area. Since my arrival here, I've been trying to look at how we could more efficiently and effectively run things at the administrative level in the district. And my reason in part for doing that was that I saw the enrollment picture, and I felt like if I'm going to get to a point where I have to start looking to eliminate other instructional positions, I first need to look administratively and see if there's something that we can do. So we are going to take that hit this year. You can see the reduction laid out. When we track these reductions, we break them down into all of their parts so that we can track, hey, did we take out salary? Did we take out FICA? Did we take out our TRS payment? So you'll see that all broken out. There's basically 4 lines dedicated to one administrative position for all the different things we pay. The other was a position I mentioned earlier in this particular presentation, and that's that one FTE, full-time equivalent, from the elementary school due to, again, enrollment decline. And you can again see the breakdown of all the things that come out of the budget. So just by removing those 2 positions, we were able to get our gap under $400,000 at $392, and we're on our way to continue to try to look for places that we can reduce to close that budget gap. So hopefully this gave you, I know I'm speed talking, but I know that people are only going to want to listen to this stuff for so long, so I have to talk fast. I'm hoping this gives you a pretty good picture of what's happening, at least initially, with the budget. I hope that you'll continue to tune in and follow how this plays out so that when it comes time in May for you to vote, you'll feel like you're a well-informed voter. As always, if you have any questions, Tony and I are available. If you want to talk something over, please feel free to give us a call. And again, thanks for tuning in and have a great day.